Josip Broz Tito, original name Josip Broz, born May 7, 1892, Gumerovec, near Zagreb, Croatia, Austria-Hungary, now in Croatia, died May 4, 1980, Ljubljana, Yugoslavia, now in Slovenia, Yugoslav revolutionary and statesman. He was Secretary General, later President, of the Communist Party, League of Communists, of Yugoslavia, 1939–80, Supreme Commander of the Yugoslav Partisans, 1941–45, and the Yugoslav People's Army, 1945–80, and Marshal, 1943–80, Premier, 1945–53, and President, 1953–80, of Yugoslavia. Tito was the chief architect of the Second Yugoslavia, a socialist federation that lasted from World War II until 1991. He was the first communist leader in power to defy Soviet hegemony, a backer of independent roads to socialism, sometimes referred to as national communism, and a promoter of the policy of non-alignment between the two hostile blocs in the Cold War. Josip Broz was born to a large peasant family in Gumerovec, northwest of Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, of a Croat father and a Slovene mother. He was apprenticed to a locksmith in 1907 and completed his training in 1910, when he joined the Social Democratic Party of Croatia-Slavonia at Zagreb. After working as an itinerant metalworker in various Austro-Hungarian and German centers, he was drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army in 1913, completed non-commissioned officer training, and was sent as a sergeant in the war against Serbia in 1914. Transferred to the Russian front in early 1915, he was seriously wounded and captured by the Russians in April 1915. After a long hospitalization, he was sent to prisoner of war camps, where he became acquainted with Bolshevik propaganda. In 1917 he participated in the July Days demonstrations in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and, after the October Revolution, joined a Red Guard unit in Omsk, Siberia. Following a white counteroffensive, he fled to Kyrgyzia, now Kyrgyzstan, and subsequently returned to Omsk, where he married a Russian woman and joined the South Slav section of the Bolshevik Party. In October 1920 he returned to his native Croatia, then part of the newly established Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and soon joined the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, communist organizer. Broz's career as a communist militant was cut short in December 1920 by a state ban against communist activities. He lost his job in a Zagreb locksmith shop and moved to a nearby village, where he worked as a mill mechanic until 1923. Having revived his links with the underground CPY, he served as a local and regional party functionary and trade union organizer in Croatia and Serbia until 1927, when he joined the CPY Committee for Zagreb, quickly becoming its organizational secretary. He promoted a campaign against party functions, the so-called Zagreb Line, thereby attracting the attention of Moscow. Rewarded by being named the Zagreb Committee's political secretary in April 1928, he led street demonstrations against the authorities following the assassination of Croat deputies in the Belgrade parliament in June 1928. His success at reviving the CPY's vitality was cut short by arrest in August 1928. The police discovered bombs in Broz's apartment, a testimony to his adherence to the new insurrectionary line of the Comintern, the Soviet-sponsored Organization of International Communism. During his trial, which ended with sentencing to a 5-year term, Broz defended himself with exceptional courage and gained further credit with the party authorities. Broz's prison term coincided with the establishment of the Royal Yugoslav dictatorship, which was promulgated by King Alexander I in order to stem the nationalistic movements of disaffected non-Serbs. In an attempt to break the modest influence of the CPY, the government arrested most of the party cadre, sentencing many of its members to terms far harsher than Broz's. Despite these blows, at the time of Broz's release in March 1934, the CPY was slowly recuperating under the agile leadership in exile of Milan Gorkic. Gorkic summoned Broz to the CPY's Vienna headquarters, where he attempted to secure his cooperation by bringing him into the CPY Politburo. It was at this time that Broz assumed the pseudonym Tito, one of many that he used in underground party work. From February 1935 to October 1936, Tito was in the Soviet Union, where he worked in the Comintern apparatus. By 1937 Tito was increasingly involved in the CPY's underground work in Yugoslavia, where he established ties with a new generation of militants. In 1937–38, Joseph Stalin's purges devastated the CPY leadership, claiming the lives of Gorky and most of the other topmost veterans. Tito profited from, and probably was an accomplice in, the repression, gaining the Comintern's mandate to replenish the CPY's leadership councils with his hand-picked lieutenants, Edvard Kardelj, Alexander Rankovic, Milovan Djilas, and Ivalola Ribar. He was the Comintern's choice for the CPY's new Secretary-General, a position he formally assumed in 1939. At the Fifth Land Conference of the CPY, an underground mini-congress held in Zagreb in October 1940, Tito sketched the CPY's leftist strategy, which focused the party on armed insurrection and on a Soviet-style federalist solution to Yugoslavia's nationality conflict. At that time the CPY had some 7,000 members, not counting the additional 17,200 members of the Young Communist League, partisan leader. An opportunity for armed insurgency presented itself after the Axis powers, led by Germany and Italy, occupied and partitioned Yugoslavia in April 1941. The CPY remained the only organized political group ready and capable of contending with the occupiers and their collaborators throughout the territory of the defunct Yugoslav state. This meant that the communist-dominated partisan units were not simply auxiliaries of the Allied war effort but an offensive force in their own right. Their ultimate aim, carefully concealed in the rhetoric of national liberation struggle, was the seizure of power. To this end, in partisan-held territories they established liberation committees, communist-dominated administrative organs that prefigured the future federal republics. As a result, Tito's partisans became a threat not only to the occupiers and collaborators but also to the royal government in exile and its domestic exponents, the Serbian Chetniks of Dragalja Mihailovic. In time, communist pressure drove the Chetniks into tactical alliances with the Axis, thereby precipitating their isolation and defeat. In 1943, after Tito's headquarters survived bruising Axis operations from January to June, particularly in the battles of Neretva and Sujska, the Western Allies recognized him as the leader of the Yugoslav resistance and obliged the London government in exile to come to terms with him. In June 1944 the royal premier, Ivan Subasic, met Tito on the island of Vis and agreed to coordinate the activities of the exiled government with Tito. The Soviet army, aided by Tito's partisans, liberated Serbia in October 1944, thereby sealing the fate of the Yugoslav dynasty, which had the strongest following in this largest of the Yugoslav lands. There ensued a series of mop-up operations that strengthened communist control of the whole of Yugoslavia by May 1945. In the process the Yugoslav frontiers extended to Istria and portions of the Julian Alps, where reprisals against fleeing Croat and Slovene collaborationists were especially brutal. The conflict with Stalin. Tito consolidated his power in the summer and fall of 1945 by purging his government of non-communists and by holding fraudulent elections that legitimated the jettisoning of the monarchy. The Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was proclaimed under a new constitution in November 1945. Trials of captured collaborationists, Catholic prelates, opposition figures, and even distrusted communists were conducted in order to fashion Yugoslavia in the Soviet mold. Tito's excesses and imitation eventually became as irritating to Moscow as did his independent manner, especially in foreign policy, where Tito pursued risky aims in Albania and Greece at a time when Stalin advised caution. In the spring of 1948, Stalin initiated a series of moves to purge the Yugoslav leadership. This effort was unsuccessful, as Tito maintained his control over the CPY, the Yugoslav army, and the secret police. Stalin then opted for a public condemnation of Tito and for the expulsion of the CPY from the Cominform, the European organization of mainly ruling communist parties. In the ensuing war of words, economic boycotts, and occasional armed provocations, during which Stalin briefly considered military intervention. Yugoslavia was cut off from the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites and steadily drew closer to the West, the policy of non-alignment. The West smoothed Yugoslavia's course by offering aid and military assistance. By 1953 military aid had evolved into an informal association with NATO via a tripartite pact with Greece and Turkey that included a provision for mutual defense. After the changes in the Soviet Union following Stalin's death in 1953, Tito was faced with a choice: either continue the westward course and give up one-party dictatorship, an idea promoted by Milovan but rejected by Tito in January 1954, or seek reconciliation with a somewhat reformed new Soviet leadership. The latter course became increasingly possible after a conciliatory state visit by Nikita Khrushchev to Belgrade in May 1955. The Belgrade Declaration, adopted at that time, committed Soviet leaders to equality in relations with the communist-ruled countries, at least in the case of Yugoslavia. However, the limits of reconciliation became obvious after the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. This was followed by a new Soviet campaign against Tito, aimed at blaming the Yugoslavs for inspiring the Hungarian insurgents. Yugoslav-Soviet relations went through similar cool periods in the 1960s, following the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and thereafter. Nevertheless, Stalin's departure lessened the pressures for greater integration with the West, and Tito came to conceive of his internal and foreign policy as being equidistant from both blocs. Seeking like-minded statesmen elsewhere, he found them in the leaders of the developing countries. Negotiations with Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Jawaharlal Nehru of India in June 1956 led to a closer cooperation among states that were non-engaged in the East-West confrontation. From non-engagement evolved the concept of active non-alignment, that is, the promotion of alternatives to bloc politics, as opposed to mere neutrality. The first meeting of non-aligned states took place in Belgrade under Tito's sponsorship in 1961. The movement continued thereafter, but by the end of his life Tito had been eclipsed by new member states, such as Cuba, that conceived of non-alignment as anti-Westernism, self-management and decentralization. The break with the Soviet Union also inspired a search for a new model of socialism in Yugoslavia. In this area Tito, never a theoretician, depended on the ideological formulations of his lieutenants, notably Edvard Kardelj. But he supported the notion of workers' management of production, embodied in the formation of the first workers' councils in 1950. In the process, Soviet-style central planning was abandoned and central agencies were trimmed. Workers' self-management had important consequences for internal relations in multinational Yugoslavia. As power steadily shifted from the Federation to the republics, conservative centralist forces fought back, opening cleavages within the communist elite between 1963 and 1972. During this period Tito purged first the Serbian centralists, notably, Alexander Rankovic in 1966, and then the leaders of the decentralizing and liberal forces in Croatia, 1971, and Serbia, 1972. The Croatian purge had a further effect of destabilizing Tito's rule in Yugoslavia's most industrially advanced republic, retrenchment of the 1970s of Josip Broz Tito. Tito's response to the crises of the 1960s and early 70s was to fashion a system of symmetrical federalism, in which various internal rules and rituals, including a rotating presidency to lead Yugoslavia after Tito's death, were supposed to formalize equality among the 6 republics and Serbia's 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and the Vojvodina. This system, enshrined in the Constitution of 1974, promoted the weaker and smaller federal units at the expense of the big 2, Serbia and Croatia. Serbia's displeasure at the independent role assigned to its autonomous provinces and the promotion of minority identity, especially that of the Albanians in Kosovo, was felt already in Tito's last years, but it became radicalized after his death in 1980. Serb resentment provided the opening for Slobodan Milosevic and other promoters of re-centralization, who contributed greatly to the undoing of Tito's federal system during the following decade. Legacy. The irony of Tito's remarkable life is that he created the conditions for the eventual destruction of his lifelong effort. Instead of allowing the process of democratization to establish its own limits, he constantly upset the work of reformers while failing to satisfy their adversaries. He created a federal state, yet he constantly fretted over the pitfalls of decentralization. He knew that the Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others could not be integrated within some new supranation, nor would they willingly accept the hegemony of any of their number, yet his supranational Yugoslavism frequently smacked of unitarism. He promoted self-management but never gave up on the party's monopoly of power. He permitted broad freedoms in science, art, and culture that were unheard of in the Soviet bloc, but he kept excoriating the West. He preached peaceful coexistence but built an army that, in 1991, delivered the coup de grace to the dying Yugoslav state. At his death, the state treasury was empty and political opportunists unchecked. He died too late for constructive change, too early to prevent chaos.